Thank you. Thank you for those who are here during the first session, and again joining us for the second session, which is on equity and humanitarian response. Now, when we were thinking about this topic and why this was important for us, because we hear all the time when there is an earthquake, when there is an emergency, the distribution of the population which is affected and who gets the response is always something that people complain about. It's not reached to the people it should reach. And especially we thought about the three particular category that when we talk about the equity, that where it is important that it reaches to those. One, that is in terms of the population itself. Especially in Nepal, you will see that there are many very vulnerable populations, especially women, children, old. And these are the populations where they have lost not just their houses, but they have lost their livelihood, and they have lost their families. They have lost, for many, everything that they had. So how do you, in those situations, not only reach to those people who have means, but also reach to those population which don't have means? Second question that we have been asking is in terms of the geography. Many of you might have traveled to Nepal, and as I look around the room, I see a lot of faces which I guess you have expertise, you have lived in Nepal and you know Nepal. The terrain is very mountainous. A lot of the three places which has been affected, access is a very huge task. Many places you can go by road, access there, and then you'll have to travel for 5 hours just by foot to even get there. So how do you also reach to those places which is unreachable? How does aid also reaches to those places which is hard to reach? And the third is in terms of the services. In terms of the services, mostly we hear about services in terms of the shelter, in terms of food, in terms of the health. But the question that we want to ask is, how do you make sure that the services which might be required in the long term, for example, psychosocial support. For example, you might have situations where many children are at the risk of trafficking. Then you need the different kind of services for those children. Or there would be sexual violence because many people are living in camps. So in terms of even services, what kind of services is required so that it is reached to the population and kind of services that is required? And lastly, I would make a small comment about services. When you hear about Nepal, there was a lot of cultural aspects to Nepal where for everyday life, these people were living in this space which they would walk through these spaces where they had walked for ages, and they were beautiful structures, temples they would visit. And one of my colleagues was mentioning that their grandmother goes to a temple every day. Now these are destroyed. So how do you make sure that services in terms of the broader aspect is also covered? So these were some of the questions that we have been asking. And as a student for Nepal, as a Harvard for Nepal initiative. Now, to start the conversation, I will briefly introduce Professor Lining, and I'll hand it over to Professor Lining to start the panel. Professor Lining is the FXB Professor of the Practice of Health and Human Rights at the Harvard School of Public Health, and she's the Director of Harvard FXB Center for Health and Human Rights, which is a Harvard-wide initiative school. And this is also a conversation that we had with Professor Lining last week, and we are continuing that conversation again on broadening these topics. So I'll hand it over to you, Professor Lining.
Thank you very much, Anuraj. So my privilege tonight is to introduce you to three excellent panelists, and we will come to the podium, each of us, and then be in front of you for the table for the response. Once people are down there, they will speak loudly because there are not recorders for the room. So, and if you can speak loudly also, that will help just for the acoustics. The topic of equity and humanitarian efforts is a rich one, and for the opening of this, we have I would like to say that we are looking now not at the immediate response. If we're talking about equity for humanitarian response, this says efforts, which is good. It allows us to talk about midterm and longer term, okay? But if humanitarian response technically could be within the first weeks of the acute event. And here we're dealing with two acute events, actually, one on top of each other. But if you're speaking about equity in that immediate humanitarian response, usually we speak about equity in access to services and equity in service delivery. That's it. You're moving fast, you're trying to find where there is the greatest need, you're trying to bring people up from wounded or vulnerable, and you're trying to establish a certain kind of health and stability. It's not simple to do that, but that's what it is. If you're talking about a longer term perspective, in any country, and in Nepal, for all the reasons that Anuraj enumerated, and I think some of our panelists will go into it in depth, this issue of equity becomes really complicated, really complicated. And I'm looking forward to that discussion. And we have three very distinguished people. Professor Jerold Kayden, who will speak first, and he's immediately to my left. He's the Frank Backus Williams Professor of Urban Planning at the Graduate School of Design here at Harvard. He's had a number of senior positions in the GSD. He's known nationally and internationally in his writing and consulting work around the relationship between law and the built environment. And he will be speaking for that zone of expertise in an imaginative way. I know he will. And our next speaker is Ankit Rauniyar. He is a master's candidate at the GSD in real estate development. He's done work as a consultant. He is from Nepal. He has a lot of experience writing cases at Harvard Business School, and he will also be addressing these issues from his perspective. And then our third speaker is Pukar Malla. He's executive director of an NGO called Daayitwa, and he's a former senior research fellow at the Kennedy School. He is a community organizer, as well as a great innovator and business person and entrepreneur. And you're going to hear him speak from a number of those different platforms. He's very interested, though, in the issues of accelerating and developing young leaders. And one point that I did not make about the ways in which the people are going to interact is they're going to have comments about their view of equity and humanitarian efforts. They'll speak for about 5 minutes, maybe a little longer, maybe a little less. Then we will have discussion among ourselves, and then we will open it up to the floor for question and answer. And I think we have ample time for that. So, Jerold, please, I think it would make sense for you to come here, because this is where the microphone is. Thank you.
Great. So the real question that one has is whether one can even afford to talk about equity when so many people across the board have been affected. And it's hard in solutions to simply target the most vulnerable populations that we know very much exist, but that are scattered about geographically. So it makes it doubly difficult when one is addressing a problem that affects everybody, but of course disproportionately affects the vulnerable populations that we hear about constantly after disasters, but that we hear about every day of the week before disasters. That's what makes the vulnerable populations vulnerable. They're vulnerable going into the disaster, and they are disproportionately affected because of that vulnerability. I'd like to address three basic questions and try to unpack a little bit of knowledge within them, recognizing that we still are very much at a questioning phase, not just in Nepal, but in these questions that I'm going to discuss, which really link to what Jennifer mentioned, the medium term and the long term. Some people call this resilience, some people call it adaptation, but what we're talking about in this area is how to guarantee the possibility that when things like this happen in the future in Nepal or elsewhere, there's a greater ability for populations, vulnerable or otherwise, to survive, and survive, if not robustly, survive well. So let me open with a Shakespearean question, which is to rebuild or not to rebuild, that is a question. It's really one of the third rails, if not the third rail, of disaster recovery discussions. It's one of the most vexing and difficult questions posed by post-disaster realities worldwide, whether in parts of Nepal or in the Philippines or in Pakistan or Haiti or Japan or New Orleans, or really where many disasters occur that tend to be locationally significant in terms of how they occur. The accepted wisdom after a disaster, especially in countries like Nepal, is to rebuild as quickly as possible in order to avoid having people in temporary or emergency shelters. The idea is not to move people into these temporary or emergency shelters for any longer than is absolutely necessary. So that suggests a rush to rebuild permanently. And that's accepted wisdom, but at the same time, one doesn't want to rebuild unsafely. And that's where the rub actually occurs. Now in Nepal, according to general data that we have, more than 70,000 houses were destroyed, 8 million people affected. We can go on and on with these sorts of statistics. And there are two different contexts to address in Nepal, the urban and the rural. There's Kathmandu itself, with its population of 1 million in Kathmandu itself, 5 million or so in the valley spread about. And we know that the entire city is not going to move. So what we're talking about there is a question of how to rebuild with particular regard to methods, capabilities, codes, cultures, etc. And I'll get into that shortly. But then there are the villages, which actually house some of the most vulnerable populations in Nepal itself. Some of the villages have been completely destroyed, but most others have suffered major damage that share some of the vulnerabilities of Kathmandu itself, but that present quite different vulnerabilities as well, that arguably make them even more vulnerable. Obviously, they are vulnerable to present and future earthquakes. The construction in the villages is often more vulnerable than construction in the urban areas, Kathmandu, Pokhara, etc. And as mentioned in the beginning of this panel, they're highly inaccessible for purposes of humanitarian relief after a disaster, talking about rescue and medical care. But they're also inaccessible in terms of rebuilding with resources from the outside. Some estimates place 1/3 of the population in Nepal at an average of 2 hours by foot from the nearest annually functioning road. We heard about 5 hours, but on average, 1/3 of the population. There are lots of airports, by the way, in Nepal. Anybody who's been there knows that. You fly in, but in fact, for these sorts of rebuilding efforts in the short, medium, and long term, that's not completely adequate. There are questions of local capacity, particularly in the village context, and especially in light of the recent political history in Nepal, where local government capacity has arguably been deteriorating over the years. And so the chief district officer becomes the key local official rather than village district councils. So all of this deals with the bounce back capacity, sometimes called resilience. That's what the Rockefeller Foundation is using as its word. And it's imperiled, particularly in the villages. So it is not unreasonable to place on the table the possibility of discouraging rebuilding of some of the villages in place. But putting it on the table for discussion, especially in an academic institution like Harvard, is not the same thing as recommending it. And there are countervailing arguments against this notion of discouraging, let alone prohibiting, if possible, rebuilding in place. This is where families have lived for generations, and their attachment to place is palpable, legitimate, fundamental to who they are. And it doesn't matter whether or not the village doesn't exist anymore. That place is still central in imagination, in culture, in religion. Columbia psychiatrist Mindy Fullilove, in the United States context, wrote a very interesting book about imposed neighborhood change entitled Root Shock. And that notion of root shock applies anywhere that people are asked to move. And the centrality of culture in this regard becomes critical. Indeed, a 2014 IFRC World Disasters Report was entitled Focus on Culture and Risk, putting its finger on this issue, the centrality of culture, the need to, as it said, quote, understand what aspects of culture may need to be transformed before disaster risk reduction and adaptation can be effective. So the village voice needs to be heard and respected. I don't have the answer then for the balance there. I do think this is a discussion, though, that needs to occur, and it's one that's overdue in Nepal and elsewhere. Second, if one does rebuild, then one has to be savvy about how to do it. That addresses more of the Kathmandu environment itself. Let's get realistic about capacities. Is there capacity? And if not, how can true capacity be created? A lot of people talk about the efficacious and useful 1994 Nepal National Building Code. And it's a start. I actually did work in Nepal back in the early 1990s, drafting a new environmental law for the country and regulations for the nascent Kathmandu Valley Development Authority. And in doing so, I had to review the existing laws that were there. And without getting into it, because we don't have time, maybe in the conversation we can, laws that were in place were not specifically appropriate for the institutional capacity at the national, let alone the local level. The building code is actually a decent kind of thing, but it's only a start. And its reach decreases as the distance from the Kathmandu Valley increases. And even its implementation within the valley itself has been incomplete. How do we know, by the way, about the vulnerability of existing structures in any event? Not a whole village, but structures themselves. Well, there's a horrible truth about any earthquake and about this earthquake, which is that it has tagged safer buildings because they haven't collapsed and they don't have cracks in their foundations and walls. Now, organizations like Map Action and others are producing maps right now of collapsed or partially collapsed buildings, and even certain kinds of crowdsourcing mechanisms can be helpful in this regard. But David Sanderson and Ben Ramalingam, in their just published report, Nepal Earthquake Response, Lessons for Operational Agencies, I think have it absolutely right. They write that, quote, building standards need to be embedded in the DNA of everyone involved, not in a law, not in a code, but in everyone involved. And that means also a different kind of builder. They talk about, and others talk about, barefoot architects. That's the notion of walking in order to create building materials. Engineers and builders, they reference the Gujarat earthquake in 2001 of India, and Seeds India working with masons associations to learn the techniques of safe building. What this is all finally about is context-based rebuilding, taking account of what was there before, but not obviously replicating the bad. Finally, how do you make things better? I wish I knew. It's always frustrating because we talk about these things before disasters and then we talk about them after disasters. And it seems that the conversation seems quite the same. It's heartbreaking to read in an IFRC report in 2014, 1 year ago. It talks about, quote, in the event of a mega disaster, such as the predicted powerful earthquake in dense urban areas such as the Kathmandu Valley. I mean, that was a year ago. Everyone knew this was going to happen. So there is useful knowledge produced. I commend you to the IFRC 2014 country case study about Nepal with regard to regulatory barriers impeding the provision of emergency and transitional shelter after disasters. I would suggest that we need the same thing with regard to the built environment in general, an effort to tie together more closely humanitarian knowledge with planning, engineering, and design knowledge writ large and outside the context of a disaster. These sorts of tying together of humanitarian and longer-term regular day-to-day activities are needed and indeed are promising. So we need this kind of study. I think the IFRC report on regulatory barriers is fine, but it limits itself to regulatory barriers. There are lots of other barriers dealing with culture and economics and finance and building, engineering, et cetera, that also needs to be thought about. Something, in short, that works in the Nepal context.
Thank you so much, Professor Kayden, for emphasizing more on the village side and your experience back in Nepal. Talking about Nepal, I am a native of Nepal, and I am from Kathmandu, pretty much 2 minutes away from the disaster where it happened in Basantapur Darbar Square. So it's basically those historic sites which gave me the inspiration to come here, study architecture, and go back and do something for Nepal. But I think it was really unfortunate that I'm still trying to complete my third degree here, and it's still I'm not being able to go back and start the developing work. And in the meantime, this is what happens. But as we talk about the efforts and the sites and the architectural elements that are there are three different categories. Basically, the historic and old buildings, which were kind of ready for renovation, but they weren't able to renovate, and those faced some disasters. And then there was these buildings that were constructed with massive urbanization in the city of Kathmandu because of almost population doubling or maybe tripling it in like last 10 years since I've been there. So just want to talk about a little bit from my background of observing how the city of Nepal, city of Kathmandu changed after since I left that place. So in my observation, there was massive urbanization in the city of Nepal, of Kathmandu. And what really happened is there was same structure, and people wanted to multiply that for the real estate purposes. And what they did is the same structure, and they came in and added more floors to it. And there was height limits to all these buildings, but they weren't able to calculate it or keep it at their level because of massive corruption in the city planning organization. And of course, then the other side was the bank financing too, which led to some of these massive buildings which weren't really designed. When we talk about design, not many buildings in Nepal or even like neighboring countries like in Bangladesh or India or in Pakistan are really designed by architects. It's basically contractors who comes in, and even if you go there with a set of plan, like I know how to work with this, oh, we're not going to really listen to you. This is how we'd be doing it. This is my forefather did it the same way. And it's basically cheap to just go ahead and build it. And the other thing is that the materials that have been used basically in the city, it's the prominent use of concrete nowadays. If you look back into the history, there's a reason why Kathmandu is called Kathmandu, because Kat, the root word, is basically means wood. And our forefathers knew it because they have pretty much experienced some of these earthquakes, and they restricted the use of heavy materials, and these lightweight construction techniques were always being used. But as these people were not there, there were a lot of new generation coming in, and they saw what was going around in the world. Why not go build higher? You have high-rise buildings that are 27 stories tall, which like even 10 years ago when I was there, nothing was really going on back then. But I think that's where I see a bigger problem. So I think when we think about rebuilding, we got to really concentrate on the materials and the capacity to be rebuilt. I mean, rather than even rebuilding for now, I think I would really suggest, we go back and look into some of these buildings and starting demoing some of these buildings, because of course there was all these buildings survived, but I'm not sure how long they can stay in together, because we expected that the April 25th earthquake one was the major one, but even aftershock, which was 7.3 magnitude, just hit a couple days ago, was a pretty impactful. And of course people say that it's not a major earthquake because it didn't have the devastation, but of course the other buildings had already fallen down. And the other idea that I want to emphasize on, like about the villages and rehabilitation about the programs is people are really native to these places, so they don't really want to leave. So my parents are still back there, and they are living, well, even I have a 5-story house, which is, I told my father to just take off 2 or 3 stories off there. But they are not ready to leave the place. I told them, you can come here because they frequently come back and forth, they visit here. I've told them, but they're like, I was born here, I was raised here, all my feelings are tied into these grounds. If I'm gonna die, I'm gonna die here. So what do you really do in that context? So I think, you know, the only thing that I can imagine doing is basically reconstructing those houses with the similar lightweight materials, so we can, you know, we still have the preservation of the ethnicity of the people, but in the long term, we can guarantee that the things are safe. So, safe. All right, thanks.
Hello everyone. Thank you Harvard for Nepal, thank you students for Nepal for this opportunity to be here and to share this moment with all of you. It was probably 4:30 in the morning when my sister was trying to reach me that morning, and I mean, in the beginning I wasn't sure, you know, what was happening, and she texted me and said there was an earthquake, but then, you know, there are earthquakes, you know, small ones, and then she said the Dharara tower is no more, and after that point, you know, since then my world and the worlds of many of us is very different. In a way where sometimes I feel like I'm becoming a different person. You know, when I was a student here about 6 years ago, and 2 years back when I was a fellow here, I always you know, wanted to, you know, find ways where we could gather experts and at Harvard, at MIT, Tufts, and so that they could come together, and Meena and I had several conversations. I'm so glad that, you know, we've all come together in various capacities and understood, you know, the call of the time. So thank you again for this this opportunity. I'm going to look at this more from an inclusion standpoint. Inclusion in the way of, you know, the victims in the affected regions not just being recipient of services, but also being co-creator of these services, so that this entire process is inclusive and leads in the direction of the resilient communities that we talked about. I'm going to make 3 points. The first one is around making sure we don't exacerbate the already existing culture of dependency. These affected districts, many of them are most locals are very much dependent on the government providing services. Many of them are also dependent on international aid organizations providing a variety of services. You know, I was just talking to one of the people in our team in Nepal, and he was saying that there's a conversation happening about prefab homes. And this is, of course, a very important conversation. Monsoon is just about to come, but the conversation is really about what kind of design, what global best practices, and who is going to provide for these resources. The conversation is not about how are these prefab homes going to be sustained? How are the skills at the local level going to be developed? And we recently also got in touch with a group of trekking entrepreneurs who were saying, what if some of these prefab homes also had an extra room for people, for tourists to come by and do homestays, right? So this is in some ways what this group of entrepreneurs in Nepal are saying is that as we go through this process of relief and rebuilding, how do we also think about building capacity at the local level, training them to think about their livelihoods, so that when we are already at rebuilding phase, people are not enormously dependent on external support. And I just wanted to quickly underscore that, you know, we have a program, a fellowship program where young professionals go work in Nepal. One of them, his home in Bhaktapur was almost, you know, so broken and not entirely, you know, devastated, but, you know, in bad condition. And even the army didn't want to go in because they're afraid. But what happened was, to salvage some of the belongings inside, the community came in and supported this effort. There's another village that one of our fellows was in, Dhading, where the relief efforts hadn't reached in one of these villages. So what did the community do? They got together and went home by home. In other words, when there is no external support, communities come together and take care of the situation, right? Which is important, because then they build that internal capacity to work with each other. They build on the social infrastructure that already exists. But when you provide everything and you make it seem like everything is going to come to you, then they're going to want to become more and more dependent, particularly in times of crisis, when you're vulnerable, when you want more support. They're not going to necessarily be thinking about, how am I going to build the home on my own? The second point that I want to make is, as we think about rebuilding, of course, we are talking about equity in terms of access to relief efforts, but we should also be thinking about equity in terms of access to infrastructure for these affected regions. Because for them to, we know very well when we heard on April 25th about the earthquake, it was first of all known as the Kathmandu earthquake, whereas it's really a Gorkha earthquake, right? Second of all, we heard a lot about Everest, whereas the countable number of people, of course it's important, but what this says is about how much do we know about rural Nepal, and what kind of communications and other kinds of infrastructure do these rural places have. So as we think about rebuilding, even if we look at building these local capabilities for prefab homes or other kinds of skills that we develop in these local communities, for them to be really able to grow, they will need these roads, access to markets, access to these infrastructures that would enable them to grow. So that's the second point I wanted to highlight. And lastly, I wanted to say that oftentimes when we look at ourselves as a global community, we think about the resources that we have and how those resources can meet local needs. Nepal as a country and all Nepalis are very thankful to all the love, support, contributions, donations, all kinds of technical assistance we've received. But it's also important to think about us, of course, having these global resources and local communities having needs, but we must also realize that local communities themselves have resources. If we only think about ourselves as collection of resources meeting local needs, then we probably are thinking about this as helping Nepal. But when we combine our resources with the resources that they have, and in the way of building local capabilities for resilient Nepal, then we are thinking about supporting Nepal. So I think it's a question that all of us should ask ourselves as we engage in multiple activities over the next decade. Are we going to be helping Nepal, or are we going to be supporting Nepal become a stronger nation? Thank you.
Before we open it up to the group for conversation and discussion, I would like to recognize Lant Pritchard, who's here. He's a professor at the Kennedy School and runs the Center for Global Development, and he has been thinking about these issues. And briefly, your reflections and thoughts, and you need to speak up because, yeah.
Just, I guess, as an economist, I want to ask the obvious question an economist would ask, which is, in the thinking of the modalities of support, a big question is whether organizations, the government, NGOs, see themselves as delivering things in kind. We'll come and build you a house, we will deliver food, versus just attempting to deliver cash. We're just going to come and say, you know, here's the value that we have raised here, and then you take care of rebuilding in the way that you want. And there are obvious big trade-offs there. There's the extent to which you give cash, you lose control over a variety of things. On the other hand, you know, these questions that are being raised of how it affects the local community, how it affects markets, how it affects everything, I think are important in the modality in which it's done. And some of the worst kind of disasters of humanitarian relief themselves is where the attempts to deliver in kind end up generating these negative feedback loops of corruption and sense of alienation. So the cash, the panelists speak to the cash versus in-kind thing, both through governmental, community, and NGO channels. I think it'd be an interesting thing to say, and the obvious thing for an economist to ask.
Well, thank you for that. I'd like to hold that question as the first one for the group to talk about. And in the reflecting on what the panel has said, I'd like to raise a couple of points, and then your reaction will not be to what I'm saying, it will be to what Lant has said, okay? And then my remarks will filter in with everybody else. And at a certain point, you can say, Jennifer, I want to respond to that, okay? But just to put this out there before you begin to reflect immediately. People are moving. This attachment to place is almost sacred everywhere in the world, except where nation states have been built on moving, and they move a lot for opportunity. So there are many parts of the world that are pretty mobile, and the populations, even the very poor, are pretty mobile. Not necessarily for choice, but for versions of economic betterment. And so that I think this recognition that people are attached to their homes, they also are attached to their children, their sense of the future, and if the whole landscape has changed, and there's nothing but fear and landslides where there used to be greenery and views, and not a 2-hour walk now, but a 10-hour walk, if ever, there will be things that shake people loose, so to speak, from these mountains. And we're already getting word that people are now coming down from the hills to Kathmandu for services, but also they're now heading south in moderately large numbers, down to the plains area. And this is a really interesting phenomenon. Apparently some have homes, some are going south for other reasons. There is that India-Nepal border area is renowned for trafficking and smugglers. So this mobility, which is in large measure new or at least accelerated because of these earthquakes, is something that we should be watching. And it should be layered into what the longer term response is going to be. Because now you have new people down in the plains. Will they come back? Okay, one question. But it's what I would like to underscore, that in the wake of disasters, you see mobility. And you could call it disaster mobility, forced migration, etc., whatever you want to call it. That is a characteristic of most disasters, natural disasters, and we're starting to see it now. Another point I would like to make, which is it's picked up by all of you, is that this problem of agency in a disaster in the local community is profound and needs to be thought about in so many different ways. I mean, cash provides agency in many ways, and so that's something the humanitarian community has learned and grasped, at least in many ways it has. But often they have not. And when it comes to rebuilding, it's going to be a very big question, I think, Len. But I would say that the stories that are coming from people here who have family ties to Nepal and are hearing now from people, and you hear this from the panel as well, these stories need to be told. People need an account of what they have been doing. They're too busy trying to survive, but their inventiveness, their resourcefulness, their ways in which they've survived, what they're doing now, how are they coping. This is part of what would be an amazing part of the next piece of work to do out of Harvard, which is for a lot of you to go home, or people who are going back there for work, begin to develop a cumulative storyboard. It could be on the web, it could be curated here. There's so much innovation in the Students for Nepal movement that I would just like to inject that idea. Stories of agency. It'll also be stories of woe and sad things, but there's nobody around to make a record now. And this is one of the most important things about these major disasters. that the record of what happened becomes lost in the struggle to survive. And Nepal has a very, very educated and innovative diaspora. It's hard when you're right there to write the story. So that's another point I would make, and it will feed this understanding of what we were talking about, which is versions of equity are equity of voice. Who are we hearing from? Then that leads to another point, which we all are aware of, and I'd like to just put it on the table, because we talked a bit before we started this panel, and it came up from all of you, so I'd want panel to think about it and the audience to think about it, which is, and Jerold spoke about it, but I'd like to reframe it a bit. We're talking about, in some ways, strategic reconstruction. Infrastructure, housing, buildings, towns, villages, livelihoods. And if you're talking about strategic reconstruction, that almost evokes, at least in English, a top-down approach. And what if we were to think about it as a bottom-up one, where, again, you're going to have to enlist voice, and you're going to have a tussle between what the rural and the mountainous area and the lowland areas and the city want. To have a really good strategic reconstruction in the context of a disaster, post-disaster, longer term, really puts pressure on governance. Can the governance mechanisms handle the cacophony of eliciting voice from everybody and still help put it together so that there is a strategic vector in the reconstruction? That hardly ever happens. Why should we ask of it and seek it in the context of Nepal, which does not have the strongest government, and as Jerold said, the local government has actually been allowed or required to sort of wither away. Really important set of questions. And I think even though it is among the very tough questions we face with Nepal, it's worth asking. Could there be a good enough governance? You know, not the perfect, but a good enough one to come together and figure out what needs to happen in one area or another. So these are points and observations, and a fugue off what you all three have said, and Lance's question is still present. It's a very evocative one, but it has a concrete focus, as he as an economist would want us to say. What about cash versus in kind? And then there's a middle one, which is not monetized. It's a kind of in kind, which is, you know, advice or planning help, which I think would be another input, although it can be looked at as top down. But so would the panelists like to comment on what Lant was talking about, and then we'll open up for larger discussion? How would cash play?
I mean, cash, look, cash is king right now in the sort of, the sort of vanguard of the humanitarian world, we all know. And, that does come out of a sort of recognition that first of all, providing goods doesn't do it. So we've moved away from the give people fish to the teach them how to fish kind of thing that Jennifer was just referring to. And then there's cash and the relative agency that cash actually provides, and the sort of repriming local markets and allowing people to engage once more. I mean, why deprive them of that? Why compete with them on that? So, I think that seems to be sort of the coin of the realm, if you will, and certainly today, I think in a lot of thinking with regard to humanitarian relief. But that deals, with the short term, more or less. I mean, one could frame it as long term. I remember when Hurricane Katrina in the United States struck, and we had the exact same debate there, where the sort of neoclassical economists were arguing, give people money so they can move to Houston. And a lot of people did move to Houston. And then there were other people, no, we want to do place. It's the place versus people debate, but in terms of cash versus place. So it can be, even in the long term, a sort of question as to what one should do. I don't know how, by the way, Jennifer, one escapes some of this top-down issue. I mean, I'm deeply sympathetic as anybody who has studied any sort of top-down planning effort anywhere in the world about the dangers of it. But at the same time, I think to myself, do we, and we is a very tricky word, whenever I teach my students about, and saying the word we, I say, ask who is we? Who's we? Always. But so when I say do we want to permit, the rebuilding, just because people want to stay in one place, recognizing that it involves resources and abilities in the short, medium, and long term. And I don't know, I don't have the answer to that. I think it's a legitimate question.
Points well made. Other yes, so we'll just go down, so.
I think coming back to the whole idea of cash versus, do we build it? It's in an intermediate level, you have to have a certain amount of plan that, you can go ahead and disperse it. Because if you give cash directly to the people that, okay, you lost a 5-story house, go build it. I think, they're gonna probably do it in a sense that they know it, so you don't have this idea of innovation and like what to really think for. But again, the top-down approach would do is like really strengthen the building codes, which needed to be there. And I mean, when we think about what really happened in Kathmandu, it's a result of the top-down not being that top-down. It's the bottom-up where people were allowed it to do what they want, like give him, like $500 and,
It was cash.
Yeah. It was direct cash to the city government. So it was like, let me pass my building, don't come and inspect, after what goes on. And that was the real problem that really we face right now, And that's exactly whenever I go back, I see the city being developed there. I was like, what do I really come back and do? Because there's nothing that, you got to demo everything down to basically, come back and make it like the city, which actually used to be back in the days. I mean, you look at these cities, I mean, they were made when Nepal wasn't that rich. I mean, if the people want to do it, they can do it. It's just the idea that they haven't faced, and they've been living a different kind of a mindset that we can keep on doing it, and there's going to be no consequences. And with this now, I have what was the stories I'm hearing, like these 27 stories tall buildings who have multiple cracks. Like people are not going back there. They're like, we're probably going to, find a different place to live, or maybe move back from exactly where we came from. But they don't want to go back into these buildings because they are so scared. So I think that is now going to regulate somehow. They're going to be thinking more like, what's the building code? Like, what are you recommending as an architect or as an engineer? Like, is this building that I'm trying to build is going to survive or not in long term? So I think things will start getting together. But I think as as a students here and people that have already been experience with all these things can really enforce the top-down approach in the intermediate.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And Pukar.
I'm thinking we will probably need a combination. So, and I'll begin with an example. So in public schools, teachers don't show up. So then, the parents are concerned, and the government wants to improve public education. So what they say is, okay, we've created these schools, but we are just not being able to monitor the teaching. So then the community gets together and surfaces this idea of community education, where the parents are in the boards of these schools, and they make sure that teachers go to school. Who are these teachers? They are friends of the parents, and the parents care for their children education. So now you are leveraging the social infrastructure to create, to improve or enhance the education system. In fact, community forestry is another very good example that has been quite successful in Nepal. So I think that there's a lot we can learn from these examples, and this also ties with your idea around the stories of agency. There are many of these kinds of stories where communities have come together to improve public services when there was not enough either top-down or bottom-up. And so they've looked at leveraging both. And I think that in this case, giving cash directly to people may not entirely solve this problem, because it might, in some sense, you might have to think about local corruption. Are people actually spending money where they said they were going to? All these things, and are they even emotionally ready in various cases? So, and in these times, this is where what you're saying around building codes or having some kind of frameworks, some ideas around what might make sense, could be valuable. So I would say a combinational approach is probably more suited now.
Great, well, thank you. Very good discussion so far. Now we want it to get very active and involve you. So please raise your hand if you have a question. There is a mic, right, great, because I think it's best if you speak into the mic, because that will then be picked up. This is being videotaped. Yes, so we have a hand down here. If you could make your question fairly short, because we have about 20 minutes. So I'd like to get as many people as we could. And if you have a question for a particular person, address it that way. Otherwise, now it's yours.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for being here. My question is about disaster mobility with the lens of equity and diversity in Nepal.
So did you all hear disaster mobility with a lens of equity? No, that's for the video.
Okay.
So that's why you have to speak up.
Speak up. Okay. So villages in hills have been destroyed, in hilly areas. And what is further troubling is now geologists are predicting that there are going to be more frequent landslides in these hills. So there's a question of where these villages are going to be resettled. We talked about disaster mobility and how it is frequent in post-disasters. But Nepal is diverse socioeconomically, ecologically, and culturally. So what are some of the challenges from the lens of equity, caste-wise, class-wise, gender-wise, age-wise, and geography-wise, when we think about resettling these populations in these hilly villages?
All right. Who wants to start with that one?
Well, I can start. It's an excellent question. One of the problems, Kathmandu is actually a little bit of land challenged. So it's not as if one could imagine the Kathmandu Valley completely accommodating everybody who might want to come in. The whole notion of urbanization as some unusual phenomenon is, of course, the opposite of what's happening worldwide. Urbanization, that is to say, movement from rural areas to urban areas, is happening not because of earthquakes and floods, but because people see greater economic and social opportunity in cities. So that's why they actually tend to move into these areas. Again, this is one of those questions where, do you organize new areas? Again, that becomes completely top down. You can't just give people land. Are these going to be sort of new towns, new settlements, new villages, towns and villages? But I do think it suggests taking a fine-tooth comb to the land area of the Kathmandu Valley, which I'm not totally optimistic about in terms of ability to expand horizontally that much, and locating other areas. And there are other areas, by the way, that could be located. So it suggests potentially identifying new terrains for development.
One of the very big challenges about Nepal, and obviously you know this far better than I, it is in many ways a pre-modern country, with modernity meaning mobility, mixing of different kinds of people, a very diverse and dense social context, and a certain amount of entrepreneurial activity. There are many parts of Nepal that are still ancient and still living as if they have lived for a very long time, with additions that come from the access of the road and electricity, etc. So what has now happened is that now there is mixing because of the disaster. And how is that going to be worked out? Just let it happen, and people go where they basically find the least common denominator, or where they can be for a while, or speak about something that is somewhat more organized. And you have a very good sense about what is likely to happen in the short run. My sense is not much in terms of that kind of conversation. But if we are thinking about how we can be helpful in the next several years, I think this sort of discussion about what is possible and what might work really does belong. In a university, and back in leadership in grassroots areas in Nepal. This is going to go on for decades, trying to figure out what Nepal is after these devastating disasters. I mean, just New Orleans, 2005. So we're, almost approaching the 10-year anniversary of it. New Orleans is about 2/3 to 3/4, depending on how you're counting, of its pre-Katrina population. Those people are not going back, the ones who have left. They're not coming back. And there are vast neighborhoods that have not been rebuilt. And although the city has a brittleness and a life, it's not the same city. That is the case. So this is why we need to be sobered by what's happened and not think that and none of us here do, that this is just a problem of saving lives. It is a problem of saving lives in the next several months. But in the longer run, this is a regional and international as well as a national problem and hopefully responsibility.
But can I just, the villages have been a wonderful historical response to the cultural, historical context of Nepal. And if they don't exist anymore and can't be rebuilt anymore because of these landslides, earthquakes, whatever, the idea that we can newly recreate exactly what was there is I think, chimerical. I don't think it's possible. However, that sensibility needs to be there if we're going to address new settlements for people who had previously lived within the context that they were used to for literally generations.
And I think perhaps can you address the uncertainty here? You were about to say something anyway, Pukar. Could I ask you, that is, we actually don't know very much still about what has happened in these rural areas, even from the first earthquake, let alone the second. So we might not want to go, and I'm speaking to myself, too far out on a reach where there's a whole lot of destruction. We actually don't know how much destruction there is. And I'm in the midst of responding to the question, if you could actually
I can begin this way. I mean, in some of the villages, there is probably only 2 to 3% of the houses that stand. So the devastation in many of these districts is quite bad. I mean, 8,000 people in 14 districts. So, in fact, the devastation that happened in Kathmandu wasn't that big compared with what has happened in rural Nepal. And so it is quite bad. And your question is an extremely difficult one, and I don't have an answer, particularly because Nepal is also a country, like you're pointing out, in terms of diversity, with more than 100 ethnic groups, or 100 ethnic languages, and more than 90 ethnic groups. And then there is all kinds of diversity. But if we look at the transition that Nepal politically made from being a Hindu monarchy, right? That system to secular republic, that's a big transition that Nepali people made. That's a very big transition that we made in 10 years.
It hasn't been accomplished yet.
No, not entirely, but at least politically.
Yeah.
Politically, right? So, and we're still, at least on the secular side, I don't think we've made the transition, but on the
monarchy side, yes.
On that side we have, right? My grandmother worshipped the king as a reincarnation of Lord Vishnu, right? So that's only 2 generations ago. So
I was thinking on the republic side, because there isn't really a constitution yet.
Yes, federal. So the point I'm trying to make is, I don't know what to make sense of that transition that we have made in terms of how much we can handle when we have to transition. But what I do think is, if such resettlements need to happen, then it would need to cater to what do the local people want. So it has to, we certainly need to have a number of bottom-up approaches, and if local governance system is not there, then we need to think about, more than just having a CDO coordinate this. There will have to be other kinds of mechanisms for that place. Secondly, it's going to take time, and we will need to, pace it so that people can adjust to the new norms. And I think your question is really a leadership question as well. So we will need to build on the community leadership that already exists.
Yeah, what I would like to add.
Could I perhaps say that? Because if everybody comments on every question, which actually is a good idea, you're first for the next one. Okay, okay. So hold on to what you were going to say, and another, yes, sir, in the back. Is there a, yeah. In given time, could you ask your question, and then we're going to have another question before everybody answers. So please identify yourself, question, and then we'll take another question, and then we'll have the panel talk.
Sure. My name is Aditya Todi, and my question is adding one more theme to equity, and that is equity of information, especially at a time when there's a lot of this mobility taking place and the community fabric is being disturbed. How does the equity of information work in terms of how do people know what rights do they have, what are the funds, or even simple information about what kind of housing materials they have access to? And the second part of this question is, then how do we go ahead and institutionalize this knowledge, especially given that we do have a fragile government at this point? And it goes back to the point, Ankit, you made, that our father's generation, our parents' generation, they, or even grandparents, some of them never experienced an earthquake. And there's a real fear of this collective amnesia setting in a few years' time. So how do we go about institutionalizing that knowledge?
Mm-hmm. Excellent question. So one more. Yes, and then I'll come over to this side. Okay.
Thank you. I'm Jigyasa Sharma from the School of Public Health. I'll make two quick comments. First,
comments or questions?
One comment, one question.
Okay.
I really appreciate you bringing up the issue of dependency, and just to add to that, Barpak, which was the epicenter for the first earthquake, was actually a very self-reliant economy, and it was doing really well. So to add to what you said earlier, it's not just exacerbating the dependency, but in some cases we would be introducing dependency in some of these settings. Another issue that I wanted to touch on was the gender inequity and how we should be mindful of that and how to address that. The landscape of inequity in Nepal is very complex. It's an interaction of gender, caste, class, geography. And in terms of gender inequity, we know, and it was brought up in the previous panel, that a lot of men are away working in the Middle East, and women are at the forefront of relief and rebuilding in many of these villages. But at the same time, we are already hearing reports about women being victims of trafficking and violence as well. And as we know from previous disasters, that in the aftermath of major natural disasters, maternal mortality always soars, mental health issues.
So your question?
So my question is, how do we address this complex interaction of inequity and make sure that women are not just passive recipients, but they're also participants in the rebuilding that will have to happen once the initial relief is done?
Great, thank you, excellent. So, speaking from the last point, some places were self-sufficient and now they're going to become newly dependent. Gender inequity is laced with other forces in society in Nepal, and now there is sort of double jeopardy inequity because of the impact of the disaster. And first set of questions relates to access to knowledge, and then once knowledge is and information, and once knowledge is generated, then how does that stay in a community in terms of the washout of disaster memory? And I could just say from experience, studying disasters around the world, if they occur within a generation, depending how long people live, it doesn't wash out. But once you have the elders either become enfeebled so nobody listens to them, or actually it's another generation and the elders have died, we've got a problem. And the last big earthquake in Nepal was decades ago. So.
Yeah, and I think just starting on that, I think that was the main reason why, when we talk about a couple decades ago, Nepal wasn't that in sense of like the Kathmandu itself wasn't that developed in terms of like concrete constructions and high rises and all these other types of buildings, because they really experienced the firsthand, right? And the information, I think, like people are really aware of this issue now, since this earthquake in Nepal has hit major parts of India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Tibet. So I think they're kind of feeling it, and they're exchanging messages between themselves that like this could happen to us too, and there are relatives that are talking within themselves that either we do something about it, or or one day there is going to be an earthquake and it's going to take our building down. So that is a pretty powerful message. That's a real experience, which if we can keep it alive, and I think it will still stay alive, because a lot of people have just experienced it. And the other issue that you raised about the gender equality and the ethnicity diversity, I think right now people can live beyond those barriers. When it really comes down to when an earthquake and a flood, people think beyond like what background you are, what you do, and all these things. But I think in the long term, it's going to affect, where people are moving, are they coming and living in our neighborhoods or not? But again, in these villages, I think we have to restrict some places that are, like really dangerous to live right next to, a big chunk of mountain or something because of landslide or anything. But there has to be, again, the local development has to come through there, and there has to be education in terms of how they rebuild these buildings again. Because all these buildings that we are talking about, which fell down in these villages, are in no way situation, of handling a 7.8 earthquake. So when we talk about that these buildings were not there, I mean, we kind of expected it. We can only hope that it doesn't go out, but as a realist, you have to imagine that it's going to go away.
So the timing is such that the two of you who have not spoken, hold your response to those two very rich questions and do something nimble with the next question that is going to come from the floor. There was a woman here. Yes, please. And I think we're going to have you give the last question. You're going to hear a response that laces in a response to the previous two, and then we're going to bring this to a close.
The issue of governance is quite complicated in Nepal, as we all know. As we are talking, there's bills being passed in the parliament. How can we channel political advocacy to incorporate the government? I think there has been some work being done in the local level, but how can we channel our political advocacy to the leaders who are passing bills right now, which will affect every conversation we are having and everything that we'll be doing? I think that incorporates mostly the really big questions. How do we become politically active as well, instead of just criticizing the government, and include them in all the conversations that we are having as diaspora, as the different NGOs are having? How can we incorporate that?
That's an excellent intervention as well as question. So I'm sure each of you, the two of you who have not spoken, is that okay? So would you like to go first, Pukar?
Sure. I'm not an expert on on thinking about gender inequality and how it plays into the aftermath. But two thoughts that come immediately to my mind. First of all, livelihoods need to be thought through, right? And this is where women can certainly play an important role, and play more important role. They already are. So this is one thought that comes to my mind. Our NGO works in Palpa and Syangza on promoting women entrepreneurship as well. So this is along those lines. The second thought here is also when it comes to creating the holding environment in my home, I look at my mom, my mother. And the holding environment in multiple homes are shaken. So I think that in that regards, the role that women will play in various households will probably only increase. but I don't know if I did justice to your question. But more on political advocacy side, the government is certainly in a listen and let's work together mode. And I have personally had conversations with various individuals in positions of authority. In fact, various authority figures in Planning Commission or even Office of the Prime Minister, they are very well known for their sincerity and honesty. So this is, in some sense, we can work more closely. But what we have also seen is that a lot of young people have come forward and been involved as volunteers, and they've gone out to the fields. So, and the country, it's primarily a young country in terms of demography. So I think that by leveraging the youth energy, we can look at political advocacy as a way of, communicating with the government on how we can move forward.
Very helpful, and thank you for that.
Sure.
Jerold, would you like to reply?
I don't think I have anything to add.
To add.
Given the
So
hour.
this is a very, very good set of replies from the three of you for very, very tough questions from the audience in a context that I think we mutually acknowledge is one of the hardest ones to consider now, that is in terms of immediate and now in this panel longer-term reconstruction. Diversity, mobility, rural-urban divide, problematic but perhaps strengthening government, a vast diaspora. So disasters create much sorrow and much loss, which we need to honor and which we have been doing. Disasters also create opportunities to think things through with attention to the past, but with the anticipation of the future. And this point that the population is young, a large number of you are out here getting beautifully trained, to me would suggest there's significant hope for the next decade. This is the length of time we're going to see the change. So thank you very much. It's a privilege to be in this role and to have a chance to talk with you and engage with our distinguished panel. And I think Anuraj would like to close this session and I think the conference. So please.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Laney. And thank you, everyone. This wonderful panel and all the conversation that we had. Just that you are here today tells us that you are concerned, but also tells us that you are making us think about the difficult questions that we will have to ask and that the insights that we will have to grapple with as we move up for the reconstruction effort. Before we close, just wanted to thank you all from the Student for Nepal initiative. Many of my colleagues are here who have been instrumental in all these initiatives to make it happen, and for Harvard for Nepal, for South Asia Institute for hosting this and making this happen. And I know that many of us have been touched by this event, and our as many of you have mentioned, that our life this event will remember for a long time. We just want to thank you, and one thing that you can do as you go from here, follow us. There is a Student for Nepal, there's a website. Follow us, Twitter, follow us. That's going to raise the work that all the students are doing, Harvard is doing. That's all we ask. And there is a vigil right after this at the Memorial Church. We would love to have you join us. It's at 7:30, so we are going to go right after there. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.